Hi, my name is Taryn and welcome to A British Audiophile and my review of the Audiolab 6000A integrated amplifier, an amplifier that retails for circa £600 here in the UK. It's very well reviewed, very well regarded, and I'm going to review this amplifier, but I'm also going to do something else. I'm going to compare it directly to another well-reviewed, well-liked amplifier in and around the £500 price point in the Iota VX SA3. That retails for circa £400 here in the UK. £400 amplifier compared to a £600 amplifier may seem like an unfair comparison, but the Iota VX adopts the direct sales method. That's where you've got no dealer distributor to deal with. They're retailing it directly and shipping it to people around the world. The perception is that that gives you better value. Now, that may or may not be the case. The reality is that Iota still have to deal with distribution themselves and marketing costs, but I won't get into that here. The question really remains, is the Audiolab 6000A worth £200 more than the Iota VX SA3? Well, I've done some extensive A/B listening between the two, so let's find out. Comparing the two amplifiers, you can see that the Audiolab 6000A is a little bit more substantial than the Iota VX SA3. It's a touch wider, about 20mm higher, and quite a bit deeper. The Iota VX SA3 weighs in at 6.5 kgs, which is quite substantial for an amplifier this size, but the Audiolab is a little bit heavier, weighing in at 7.8 kgs. So if the Iota is Roy Jones, the Audiolab has to be Mike Tyson. So let's take a look at this sucker from the front. Sorry, I don't know what's got into me. I think I've been watching too many boxing videos. Let's power up the Audiolab 6000A. Power it up, display lights up. After a couple of seconds, you'll hear a click. There it is, and it's powered up and ready to go. And starting from the right-hand side, you have the power button, the IR sensor, 6.25mm or 1/4" headphone socket. Volume control moves from -78, I think in dB steps, all the way up to, let's turn that round, to +8. There's a nice OLED display in the middle, and then you have the mode button here on the left-hand side, and that allows you, if you click it, to control the balance, also to control the filters. And I'll just go into the filters a second. There's a slow filter, which I quite liked, phase filter, which I found a bit warm and fuzzy, and the fast filter, which I found a little bit edgy at the top end. So most of the time I listened in the slow filter mode. And again, clicking through that, you can go to the trigger, which allows you to control other devices, enable that or disable it. There's a standby mode, and that's quite handy because you can actually change the amount of time you want it to be on standby, so it cuts off if it hasn't got a signal after 20 minutes, 1 hour, or never. It's quite a handy function to have. And there's a reset to go back to factory default settings. The other thing that the mode section does, if you don't press it in, is allow you to select between an integrated amplifier, pre-power, that's separate pre and power for effectively home cinema use, and just the preamplifier on its own. Let's get that back to integrated. And these are your input selectors. So you've got the phono input, BT, which is Bluetooth, 3 analog inputs, 2 optical inputs, 2 coaxial digital inputs. Looking at the rear, starting from the left-hand side, there's a button to permanently power the device on and off. Below that is a standard IEC connection with an internal fuse, and then standard quality speaker binding posts, but they're good enough to get the job done. Next to that is the Bluetooth antenna connection, and below that is the 12-volt trigger connections to power on and off other devices. Adjacent to that are the digital inputs, and there's 2 optical digital inputs, and below that 2 coaxial digital inputs. The USB input here is purely for firmware updates and to connect the Audiolab 6000A to Audiolab Streamer. There's no USB input for the DAC. If you want a USB input, you will need an external USB DAC. There's a whole series of analog connections. The first one is the pre-outs. That effectively allows you to use the Audiolab as a preamplifier, and adjacent to that looks like a standard line level connection. It isn't a standard line level connection. It's basically the power input. So in pre-power mode, that allows you to use the Audiolab as a power amplifier. That may be useful for people trying to integrate this into a home cinema. Adjacent to that are 1, 2 and 3 standard line level analog connections, and the final connection is the phono input for your turntable with a ground connection for the turntable at the end. Now apologies everyone, I couldn't get the lid off this thing. The screws require the tiniest star-shaped connectors and I didn't have one small enough. So I'm going to have to rely on this photograph that Audiolab kindly supplied. Starting from the top left-hand side, there's the phono stage. Now next to that is the analog preamp section, and adjacent to that, the board that sticks up is for the DAC and the SPDIF digital connections. That's your Toslink and coaxial connections. The DAC is based on the ESS Sabre 9018 chip that Audiolab have quite a bit of experience with, because their MDAC, which is a well-renowned DAC from a number of years ago, was based on that chip. Below that is a dedicated headphone amplifier, and then you have the power supply. Now that big round object is the toroidal transformer. That's a 200 VA toroidal transformer, more than what you'd ordinarily expect to see in an amplifier this size, and those 4 capacitors each are 15,000 microfarads, so a total of 60,000 microfarads of capacitance. That smooths out the ripples in the voltage, and that's your current reserve essentially. Again, way beyond what you'd normally expect to see on an amplifier at this price point. Normally around 20,000 microfarads is what you tend to see. To the left of the power supply, you'll see the power amplifier modules, and there's 2 identical modules with 2 large heat sinks and 2 transistors mounted onto each heatsink in the classical Class AB configuration, push-pull if you like. That's where you've got 1 transistor looking after half the signal and then handing over to the other transistor to look after the other half. I don't think there's anything to suggest that they're anything other than bipolar devices. There's nothing in the literature to say they're MOSFETs or JFETs, so I'm assuming they're bipolar transistors that are taking care of the amplification. And the final thing to mention is on the extreme left-hand side at the bottom, you've got a microprocessor, which is for system control. Right, so let's kickstart this comparison in terms of sound quality between the Iota VX SA3 and the Audiolab 6000A. Now, for the sake of my sanity, from this point onwards, I'm just going to refer to the 2 amplifiers as the SA3 and the 6000A. But I think you know what I'm talking about. In terms of the overall tonal balance of both of these amplifiers, they're fairly well balanced across the frequency range, but they both lean on the cool and slightly lean side of neutral. Now, on initial audition, they may sound very similar, but when you spend any time with both of these amplifiers, there are some distinct differences that come to light. So let's break that down in a little bit more detail. In terms of bass performance, it really is a matter of personal taste which of these 2 amplifiers you will prefer. The SA3 is a fuller, punchier, weightier bass compared to the 6000A, where the bass is faster, tighter and better controlled. So the SA3 has a more engaging, more fun, dynamic type of presentation, whereas clarity, refinement and speed come with the 6000A. Pay your money, take your choice. In terms of mid-range performance, this is where the 6000A pulls ahead of the SA3. Both amplifiers have a tonal balance that's on the lean side of neutral. That's smart voicing at this price point. The reality is, at this price point, if you want weight, body and richness in the mid-range, it comes at the expense of clarity. You just don't have the quality of components or the beefiness in the power supply to deliver authority in the mid-range without a lack of resolution. The 6000A gives up less in this area than the SA3. Instruments are a little bit fuller, vocals are fuller, and the Iota sounds a little bit thin in comparison. What's really excellent about the 6000A is the amount of resolution and detail on offer here. It's really quite exceptional. Leading edges of notes are good on both amplifiers, but it's even cleaner on the 6000A. as is the decay structure, which is more apparent on the 6000A than it is on the SA3. There's more space and more openness in the mid-range. Both have a really nice wide soundstage. There's limited soundstage depth on both of these amplifiers. That's to be expected at this price point. But the more resolute, the more clean, the more open mid-range comes with the 6000A. In terms of upper mid-range performance, again, this is an area where typically amplifiers struggle at this price point compared to more expensive amplifiers. Almost all amplifiers at this price point have a slight hardness to the sound in the key area between 2000 and 5000 Hertz. It's what I describe as a metallic quality or a solid state sheen. Now, in this area, the SA3 performs very well, but the 6000A is remarkable in the lack of glare and harshness that is apparent. And it's a very similar story higher up in the range as well, in the high frequencies. The SA3 is slightly boosted in that region. The sibilance control isn't quite so well refined as it is on the 6000A. It gives the SA3 a slightly more lively sound, especially that lively bottom end and that slight boost in the top end. There's a more mature, more refined sound to the upper mid-range and the high frequencies in the 6000A. Both these amplifiers come with internal phono stages and headphone amplifiers. Now, I don't test those features, it's not my wheelhouse. For those of you interested in those features, I'm sure you'll find other reviews that can provide you with that information. What I did do though is test the DACs extensively in both of these amplifiers. Now, when it comes to the SA3, the internal Burr Brown DAC I felt dropped the performance down a level. That's primarily the reason why when I reviewed the SA3 it got a highly recommended and not an outstanding. It does offer an awful lot of performance for its £400, but the DAC does not live up to the quality of the amplifier. I think most people who are buying that amplifier will want to go out and spend £200 on an external DAC so that they've got a DAC that's comparable to the quality of the amp. When it comes to the Audiolab 6000A, this simply isn't the case. Audiolab's expertise in developing DACs really comes to the fore here. The internal ES Sabre DAC based around the 9018 chip really is excellent. Of course, you can get better sound. I tested it with my Chord Mojo, that was a bit fuller and richer, and the Denafrips DAC that I have here for review takes performance to another level entirely. But the internal DAC on the 6000A is excellent for what is included. I don't think anybody buying this amplifier needs to go out and buy an external DAC unless they want a USB connection. Now, I want to take a moment here to applaud Audiolab and its parent company IAG for the amount of technical information they publish about this amplifier on their website. It really is very comprehensive, and I'll place a link in the description notes so you can have a look for yourself. There's an awful lot of information on there, including something very important, the peak current capability of the amplifier. Now, the peak current capability of an amplifier is very important because it tells you what it's capable of delivering in those transient peaks where you may have a kick drum hit and you need an awful lot of power very quickly. The peak current capabilities of the Audiolab 6000A are 9 amps, and that's perfectly fine, perfectly respectable at this price point, but I was hoping for a little bit more. Given the beefiness of this power supply, this amplifier has a 200 VA transformer and some 60,000 microfarads of capacitance, way beyond what you'd normally expect at this price point. So I was hoping it would have been a little bit higher, maybe 12 or 13 amps at a push. 9 amps is absolutely fine though. It does mean that you have to be realistic about the type of speakers that you need to accompany with this amplifier. At the end of the day, it's a 50 watt amplifier into 8 ohms going up to 75 watts into 4 ohms. It will drive moderately efficient speakers in small and medium sized rooms absolutely fine. It won't drive difficult speakers that are highly inefficient or that have very unusual dips in their impedance curve. So stick to speakers that have got sensitivities ideally in the high 80s and above and a relatively flat impedance curve, and you'll be absolutely fine. In terms of what I tried it with, I tried the Audiolab 6000A with a bunch of speakers, some relatively easy to drive, others more difficult, just to see what this amplifier was capable of. One of the first speakers I tried was the ATC SCM7s that I had in for review. Now that's a speaker that retails for £875 here in the UK, but it's quite demanding in terms of the amplification needed to drive it. The 6000A struggled, in fairness. They sounded quite flat and lifeless. It fared better with my Pro-Ject Response 1SCs. The latest incarnation of that is a speaker that retails for £2,000, so perhaps an unfair comparison, a speaker at a different price point. The Audiolab did a reasonable job of driving the Pro-Jects, in fairness. Right, to get the most out of the Pro-Jects, I'd want a more expensive amplifier with a bit more body and richness in the mid-range and a little bit more grip and control to widen the soundstage. But this little amplifier did a remarkably good job, and it fared very well with the rest of the speakers I tried, including the PMC 2521Is that you see behind me, another speaker that retails for £2,000, but is a slightly easier load than the Pro-Jects, much easier than the ATCs. The clarity and the definition and refinement of the Audiolab shone through, and the PMCs are a little bit tonally on the cool side of neutral, as is the Audiolab, so for people looking for a warmer sound, perhaps would look for a different type of speaker. I tried it with my PSB Imagine Minis. They retail for £600, or they did when they were available. Drove those perfectly well, and also the Acoustic Energy AE300s that are in for review. Another speaker that retails for £600, and it drove those perfectly well. So I think if you stick to speakers that are reasonably easy to drive, as I mentioned, and in and around its price point, I don't think you're likely to go wrong. Okay, so it's time to start thinking about wrapping things up. Now, just before I do that, I want to be honest with you about one thing. I've always traditionally struggled with amplifiers around the £500 price point. I'll just explain why. I get what happens around the £200 to £300 price point. That's where the big corporations dominate, the likes of Yamaha, Sony, and all the Sound United stuff from Denon, Marantz, and Onkyo. They can bring their big economies of scale to bear and offer quite a lot of performance for the money. I also understand what you get for £1,000. That's where small audiophile companies can do their stuff and shine. There's some really nice integrated amplifiers around the £1,000 price point from the likes of Name, Exposure, Musical Fidelity, Rega, and Audiolab themselves. But it's this £500 price point in between where I felt it was like the forgotten middle child. I didn't feel that amplifiers at this price point offered a huge amount of performance over and above the stuff at £200–300, and I felt they were quite a way away from what you get at around £1,000. A little bit unfair? Perhaps. I decided to make a conscious effort to review a number of amplifiers around the £500 price point for two reasons. The first was accessibility. I'm hoping that around £500 amplifiers are still accessible to a large number of people. And the second was intrigue and interest. I listened to a few amplifiers at different scenarios in different settings, and there were a few that piqued my interest. I decided to review the Pro-Ject MaiA S2. That retails for £600. It's a very fine sounding amplifier, but it has very limited amounts of power delivery. And that was the reason it primarily got a recommended from this channel, because it was limited in terms of the type of scenarios you could use it in. I also reviewed the NAD C338, and that's a good all-round performer. Not the last word in terms of sonic performance at this price point. It retails for £600. It has a built-in DAC that's of reasonable quality, and it also has a built-in streamer, so a good one-box solution for people looking at this price point. It got a highly recommended from this channel. I also looked at the Iota VX SA3. Now that's an amplifier that retails for £400. It's a very fine sounding amplifier. Those of you who've got £400 to spend can buy that with confidence. The only reason that did not get an outstanding from this channel was because the internal DAC, I felt, downgraded the performance a little bit and dropped it to another level where people may want to go and buy an external DAC if they're using that amplifier. So how does the Audiolab 6000A fit in? Well, out of the bunch, this is comfortably the most accomplished, most refined, and most detailed sounding amplifier. It gets an outstanding from this channel. Only the second product since me doing this channel to do so, so that's some accolade in my book at least. It has a level of resolution and detail that you wouldn't normally associate at this price point, be associated with the price point above. Okay, it doesn't perhaps have the same grip and control as the best amplifiers at £1,000 price point, but it doesn't come that far off. A very accomplished amplifier comfortably justifies its £200 price point increase over above the Iota VX. The DAC inside the Audiolab justifies that alone, I feel. Okay, so that pretty much wraps things up for the Audiolab 6000A review. All that remains for me to say is thank you for watching. Please like this video if you like it, please share it. And for those of you who haven't subscribed already, if you like what I do with this channel, please think about subscribing. But for today, for now, a British audiophile signing off.